Yes, what you're going to get from me in the next half hour is a sneak preview of the Nostradamus report that we are releasing tomorrow. Of course, you should also come to the long presentation tomorrow, when we will also have a really interesting panel discussion afterwards about diversity and how we're moving forward with that, now that we've done all the obvious things. You may not be familiar with the Nostradamus report, so I'm going to first explain a little bit about that. It's an annual report commissioned by the Nordic film market and this festival that looks at the near future of the film and TV, or the screen industries more broadly, but our focus is often in film and television. We have a new main partner, lead partner, which is Filmivest, and we are so grateful for their support, which it feels that it has enabled us to perhaps continue to take this work to a new level going forward, and we also have other generous supporters about whom we are very grateful. Now, of course, actually predicting the future is very difficult, so we have a cheat method, which is that we speak to people who are working in strategic positions on projects that will come to fruition 3 years from now, 5 years from now, people who are in positions where they are either in practical production or they are changing the directions of organizations that are making an impact, or who are working with analysis. These are this year's 10 interviewees that we have spoken with relatively deeply. They're from this year the UK, France, Sweden, Finland, Norway, and Brazil. I felt that was a nice range. They're representing broadcasters, production, VOD streaming, sales, public film funding, and industry analysis. And I think quite possibly Leon, Alexandra, Lars, and Anna might be in the room, so thank you, of course, especially to you all for the generosity with your time. This is a big reveal. This is this year's headline, which we haven't, I think, told anyone yet. The report now is called A Creative Explosion. And in the next 3 to 5 years, it's going to be good news all around. However, if you have heard me speak in the last year, you know that last year I was talking almost exclusively about the end of the world. And before we go to all the interesting and fun things that are happening right now, I need to remind you that because our scope is 3 to 5 years, it means that what I said last year and the year before and so on is also still true and valid. I spent this year, to be serious for a moment, speaking quite a lot to the industry around the world about fascism and climate change, about the threats to public art funding, the threats to the survival of the civilization which we are part of, and to the economic system on which we rely. Of course, our audiences, globally speaking, are a stable middle class with free time and free money, and whenever that is threatened, so of course is all of our work. But I mean, I just want to say, as Greta Thunberg says, our house is still on fire. So, of course, literally every decision that you ever make at work for the rest of your lives, you're going to have to take these macro trends first and consider everything you decide to do in the context of what is going on in the world. So something is this my earring, perhaps? Let's just take that off. But I also want to just mention, again, this threat of the populists and the fascists that are increasingly gaining power also across Europe. If you are not today afraid of this political development, it's a sign that you're cis, straight, white, and middle class. And it's also a sign that you do not work in a diverse enough environment. If you are not afraid today, it means that you don't have enough colleagues who belong to ethnic minorities in your country, who belong to sexual or gender minorities. And that's just a fact. They are very afraid, and so should we all be. Because, of course, in this industry we have responsibility, but it also, in practical terms, if the shit really hits the fan, we are also targets. So, with this depressing news, I just want to remind you that that is also true. However, in the short term, in the next few years, we might be distracted to not think about that very much. So let's just keep that at the back of our heads as we talk about all the immediately exciting and positive things that are happening. So these are the headlines of the 7 chapters of this year's report. Diversity beyond 50-50 is a big theme, of course, because this festival, I don't know if you know, but Göteborg has this year been the first international film festival in the world that actually delivered on its pledge to have 50%, or more than 50% in this case, of the directors of the almost 400 films that are screened this year are directed by women. So that is amazing, and we're looking on how to move forward about that across the industry. What happens after the streaming wars? We're going into that in some detail. I'm not going to talk about the technologies today, but if you just want like an update on a few pages of what's happening, broadly speaking, with the technologies and the different business models in streaming, you should download the report tomorrow when it becomes available. It's written in a way that shouldn't require you to actually like know very much about this in advance. So we're also just trying to help everybody stay up to date with things that might seem complicated, but are not actually all that complicated. It's just that there's a lot of abbreviations in the words. We're talking about feature film. I'm going to talk about that. We're talking about what is happening with the windows. I'm going to talk about that today briefly. And we're talking about some of the problems that are happening from all of these boom years that we are approaching. And we've touched upon that, of course, in the last 2 days. So I'm going to also go into that a little bit. And the thing that I'm not going to be talking about at all today, which is one of the reasons why you should definitely come tomorrow, is that, of course, also in the next 5 years, there's going to be a big conceptual change of all of the most basic ideas that we have about like what is a moving image. For instance, we tend to think that they are, broadly speaking, two-dimensional, or at least happening on the screen. And of course, we know that with what is happening in VR and AR, but also many other things like deep fakes, mean that probably, culturally speaking, everybody's relationship to the moving image is going to change very rapidly in the next 5 years. And that's going to recontextualize what we do quite a lot as well. And that's worth thinking about. We're not going to think about it today, but you should come for that tomorrow. My favorite news is this good news, which is only indirectly relevant for TV drama, but I do have to mention it. Art house cinema is back. And the way we started writing this chapter is that about sometime last year, I started to notice that friends who are not in this industry at all started to talk about film again. And not only were they talking about it, they were talking about it with their bodies. They were like making gestures when they were speaking about films that they had seen, because it was like the words were not quite enough to express why they liked what they had seen so much. The Favorite is an obvious example. People are like, you have to see it. Okay, that's interesting. I mean, it's a very good movie, but like that was like, what's going on here? And of course, when we're talking to people across the industry, a lot of people are saying the same thing. Something is happening, and we're seeing it with audience response also. We're seeing it in the box office, but something really exciting is happening in art house cinema right now. In fact, there's a level of excitement and a level of new voices, not always young voices, a lot of them are middle-aged, but who are just breaking through now, because there's been a lot of market reasons after the financial crisis of 2001 and 2008, why a lot of new voices didn't come in. And I don't need to tell you about what happened in home entertainment and so on. But as an industry, feature film was taking less risks, basically. And also the middlebrow film, for structural reasons, was sort of marginalized. So the career paths for feature film directors weren't quite there, and that is changing now. So we're getting a lot of the best talent is breaking through internationally, and people are responding to this with a level of excitement that reminds me very vividly of watching Tarantino in 1994, 1996. You know, that level of like, oh, film is so cool, even young people. Kors i taket. So that's a very interesting thing that we're just, I think, on the cusp of a big breakthrough of this right now. And while all of those structural reasons, I mean, because I have this theory that we get a new revolution in cinema in every 20 years. We get it in the 50s, we get it in the 70s, we get it in the 90s, and so on. And then we should have gotten it about 10 years ago, and it didn't happen in feature film. And the reason, of course, it didn't happen is all of you. It went to television instead. That's where the creative revolution went. That's where the talent went. And in particular, feature film became whiter, older. It felt a little bit unfashionable. It felt less relevant in content often. No offense if you're feature film producers, which of course many of you also are. I'm sorry. But there were many more possibilities for complexity in television and treating the audience with more intelligence as well, and more just work opportunities for women and diverse storytellers in television. I mean, not great, but much better than in feature film. And that really has had an effect. And of course, over time, as film production got cheaper, inevitably, this was going to happen. Like at some point, we're going to reach just the tipping point of so many interesting filmmakers that people will start to take note. And that's where we are right now, and I think we're going to see an explosion of this in the next few years. Now, what is it? What kind of film is it that people are responding to? I think they are aesthetically elevated. They're visually very specific and very strong. They're very visceral. You can feel it in your body when you're watching it. I mean, there are some cases, Uncut Gems, I had the pleasure of seeing here at the festival last Friday, which is the best film Adam Sandler has ever been in. It's a Netflix original. It's 2.5 hours of holding your breath. You could literally hear in the cinema at weird moments people going like, because they had forgotten to breathe. That's how intense it is for 2.5 hours. It's a little bit too much to not breathe for 2.5 hours, but it's still very interesting. I mean, art house movies when I was young were boring. That doesn't work for this generation. So that they're very narratively driven. They're very paced, sometimes to an extreme. And a feature film now is short. It's a weird thing, but because of serialized drama, of course, a feature film now is considered relatively short content from the audience's perspective. So if you're going to have an experience that is just 2 to 3 hours, 3.5 hours if you're Scorsese, and if it's going to be just that, then it has to be deep instead, because it can't be stupid. Do you see what I mean? They still want the complexity and the quality that they're used to, especially from the most complex TV drama. They want the big world. They want that situation that you can be in. They want a lot of rewatch value if it's just going to be like a one shot. So it needs to be very dense, very well written, very well. The mise en scène needs to be very strong, because it still needs to be as good, so that you get as much out of it with that shorter time commitment. And there's something here that I think is really relevant to what we've been talking about on stage. We've been talking about what role procedurals have for the audiences now. So maybe viewing behaviors are splitting along lines of not like feature film and serial drama necessarily, but long commitment and short commitment, one shot and series. Art house versus Marvel Cinematic Universe, for instance, but also art house versus TV drama. And we all know, of course, about the tendency towards shorter series in serialized content as well. And there's something there that is really interesting. And we don't know enough about this, but you who are broadcasters, you have data. And please look at that data and come back and tell us in a panel next year or as soon as you can what you have learned about how these different behaviors operate. The window system is being really challenged, and the exhibitors, as you know, are not super excited about this, but everybody else except the major exhibitors of the world agrees that this train has already sailed. Like this conflict is now over. Clearly, I mean, in places like South Korea, there's been since 2013 a premium VOD window that starts where a big premiere starts streaming 4 weeks after their cinematic premiere, and that's supported by the major studios, and everybody is making money. Possibly even the exhibitors are not losing money. We don't know exactly, but the evidence is inconclusive. But it's very clear that windowing is changing. And of course, windowing is also changing because when broadcasters or streamers are funding film content or funding any kind of content, the order of the windows will change relative to who has paid more. That's how it has to be. So probably exclusivity is going to go down, and we're going to see very different patterns for different kinds of content across the windows. And we go into this in some more depth of what this can look like in the report as well. So there's something here that where we cannot separate in our thinking. Again, feature film and TV drama. We need to think about what genres seem to work better. Lars Blomgren says in the report that when have you last seen a thriller in the cinema? That feels like a home genre now. And it can still be 90 minutes, right? It can still be a 90-minute thriller, but you're not going to see it in a movie theater. You're going to see it at home. Comedy, probably you're going to see it at home. Why is that? Like, what can it give? I mean, Uncut Gems, kind of a thriller, but then it needs to give you something massively cinematic, and that's a Netflix original, so most people are not going to see that in the theaters either. There's something here that's really interesting. And I think there was a time, I'm still of a generation, I'm 41 now, where TV film had low status. I think we have to understand that if you're 25, A, you don't know what a TV film is. Like, that word doesn't even mean anything to you. But probably all film is TV film now. All film is living room film. And some film is also theatrical. And quite possibly, with more and more with these hybrid forms, maybe some miniseries are also theatrical, possibly. Or like, if most of the people who watch The Irishman are watching it 2 or 3 nights at home, which is, I think, the likeliest way that they're going to do this, because it's so very long. You can even go online and see like best cutoff points to split The Irishman. Like, there's a little diagram that people have prepared. You stop after this scene, you stop after this scene, you stop this. Or if you want to watch it 4 nights, you do it this way. So is that really a feature film? Like, those distinctions are harder to do also, of course, because we also see in some genres, I think now in the report we talk briefly about a Finnish show called Force of Habit, which is released both as a feature version and as a longer TV series, for instance. So again, we know that streaming services are not going to be giving us viewing data, and the audience is clearly ahead of us on this. Like, there's something, I think, my intuition is that there is a clear pattern for how the audience is engaging with these different formats and with different kinds of viewing behavior. And we don't know what that is, because we're stuck in the old paradigm where the formats are much more connected to how they're funded and what their histories are and so on. And the audiences now are ahead of us, and I think we need to figure out, and again, broadcasters, I'm looking at you, but it's not just about looking at numbers. We're going to need qualitative data. I think we're going to need to spend some time with people. And this is the way where we can all do it on the cheap. Like, have some in-depth conversation with somebody who is not working in the industry about what they are watching, when, how, and why. And then don't entirely trust them on the why, because people don't know. But listen very attentively and read between the lines, and you might find the real answer. So this miracle of the art house renaissance, of course, is a consequence, I think, of television. And it's interesting because in the feature on the film side, people were very shocked that the streaming services even existed. But it would seem that streaming has contributed to this filmmaking renaissance in at least 3 incredibly important ways. One is that a lot of really good filmmakers have been allowed to just take a bag of money and go away and do something without very much interference, and with sometimes excellent results and sometimes mediocre results, but that's how this works, of course. The audience has been trained, and this is, of course, starts much earlier than the streamers. This starts with serialized cable drama, with the early HBO shows and so on. But we have trained a generation and a half now in following incredibly complicated stories, and in taking pleasure in incredibly complicated stories. And I'm not going to go into that now, and I mean, because it's a whole thing, but there's a lot of very plausible theory that says that when we live in complicated times, it changes our brains, so we are better at reading complex relationships and being in complex environments. And that's why we also need more complicated entertainment today than we did 20 years ago, let alone 40 years ago. There's also, this is connected to wider trends in society, but certainly feature film wasn't able for a long time to deliver on that. And on television, we have been making stories multifaceted and nuanced and deep and long and weird in a way that wasn't available for a long time. And we trained the audience in developing that taste. And of course also training, and which has raised the status of scriptwriters, of screenwriting, enormously. And that has moved out across the industry in different ways, and we need to look at that because it's very clear that the screenwriters are a resource that is completely vital to this relationship to the audience and to the relevance of the work. The streaming services have trained the audiences in reading subtitles. We talk always about Narcos and so on, and Netflix's strategy, but as you all know, probably the most subtitles you read every day are in your Facebook feed on all of those viral videos with the sound off. And that's actually really good, just basic training for a global audience, that subtitles are no big deal. Yes, say all of we who are from small language areas. And of course, then also SVOD services have experimented and pushed different ways of taking content to market across platforms. It's a miracle what's happening, and it's TV's miracle. And it's just important to remember that we shouldn't be sidelined when this happens, make ourselves irrelevant. We have to see what are the lessons here and how do we continue to use that in our TV work. And I just put a picture here from Russian Doll, which is a TV show about a very intelligent middle-aged female professional who uses too much eyeliner and makes very dodgy life decisions. I watched this show like I was going to church. I have never felt so seen in my life. And I'm white, urban, middle class. Like, I should be represented already, but I felt when I watched Russian Doll, like, no, I actually haven't been represented before. It's like, now I feel represented. I mean, she is much cooler, obviously, but it's still like that. Like that's a goal. Like that's a goal that I don't see in every TV show with a female prime minister. I'm very impressed by them, but like I don't see the immediate relationship with myself. But this crazy ass bitch, like yes. So and there's something there that is really important. That if I was able to make it to almost 42 before I found a TV show that I felt was like spot on for me, how many other people in our core audiences have we missed? And I mean, and another thing that this show was really good at was effortless diversity. And that raises some questions, and I think in the light of what I've heard on this stage in the last 2 days as well, about what is niche entertainment and what is broad entertainment. Because it would seem that we are all trying now, much more than before, which is fantastic, to make series that are closer to reality. We want to go closer to specific environments, specific communities, specific subcultures in our different nations and areas, and say, okay, this is going to be specifically this. Like this is specifically a sort of queer artist environment in New York, which is relatively like an upper class alternative environment, rich people with bohemian lifestyles. And if you've ever been in an environment like this, I can say this is very, very close to a real thing. And of course, that's what we want to feel every time we watch a TV show, that we're seeing something. You know, I haven't been a 13-year-old who drives a Volvo in the Norwegian countryside, but I felt very strongly with the work in progress that we saw, or with this upcoming series that we saw, that like, yes, that what's happening on the screen here, that is true, that is real. And we clearly need to be in those environments. At the same time, we live in such polarized times, and we live in such polarized societies, that what is real for one group is not necessarily real for somebody else. I live in Skåne. On my block, we're the most diverse and most progressively voting in all of Sweden. But you don't have to drive more than 20 minutes out into the countryside to get somewhere where people vote brown. So, which means fascist. And I mean, if those voters and my block watch the exact same TV show, will we feel similarly about the reality of the realness of the world that is being described? And I think that the answer is that this is why we can't cheat. Like, we can't put the symbols of diversity or the symbols of reality there. It has to be true and it has to be heartfelt, because I think every viewer, regardless of their background, needs to connect on a human level with environments that they have not and don't have any personal experience of. And only through that artistic human connection can they also say, okay, this is also real. This is also humans that exist in the world. These are also lives that are worth thinking about. Yes. And I mean, and just in a sort of strategic term, then the question is, in a polarized society, how do we segment audiences? We all understand that just age groups and genders is not enough, and certainly not these ridiculously large segments that we've had. It's like 20 years. No. Of course, we need to see where are the cutoff points of media use in different generations. That's one way of segmenting that we need to look at. But there are probably other kinds of sort of sociological segments that we need to work with more tightly. And here again, the national broadcasters have a history of doing this for a long time, and a skill set that we haven't used that skill so much on the TV drama production side necessarily, but I think it's worth looking. What would happen if you put a statistician, like if you let writers speak to audience insights people, for instance, already, like while they are writing? Could something happen in those kinds of exchanges? Yeah. So we heard yesterday from Guy that content investment in the world has gone up, sports not included, 30% in the last 5 years, and is projected to go up and another 26%, very specific number, I love it, another 26% in the next 5 years. So it's going to be this wonderful creative chaos. We're going to be able, there's going to be just so much fantastic content. This is the meme from Aniara, the Swedish poem and film, if you haven't seen it, it's lovely, where the people are watching these internal visions of projected dreams. And maybe it's going to be like this, that we're just, the whole world's population is just going to be like hypnotized by TV drama. But I mean, I think we all have the intuition that's probably not what's going to happen. Like it's people are not going to be watching significantly more hours of television just because more is available. That's probably not how it's going to go. But the time of the audience is a hard limit, depending on the age somewhere, and depending on what kind of video content we're talking about, up to 5 hours per day. And for high-end drama, probably absolutely no more than 3 hours a day on average. So that's a real limit. And at the other end of the chain, of course, or at the beginning of the chain, in production, capacity is a limit. And we're having these problems about the capacity problems are connected to quality problems, like we talked about yesterday, so I don't need to go into it since we've already talked about it. But clearly, there are dangers here, because in this environment, there is no way that anybody is going to commit to something that is not good. Like, you're never going to watch 3 hours of something terrible anymore. Never. Because there's just not time. And there's no need. Because you can literally just like press next. Like, you don't even have to wait for the next show to start. It's right there. It's queued up for you. So we can't afford to artistically fail. And that's a really strange position to be in, because we all know that sometimes we artistically fail. That is something that happens. But it can't happen as often as it has historically. And how do we stop that from happening? Guys, I don't know. But we need to think about that really hard. Probably consolidations a few years from now. And that probably means that there will be less artistic freedom sort of on average in the marketplace. But right now, there is this window where there's a lot of money, a lot of negotiating possibilities, a lot of possibilities of testing what to do with the windows and how do we connect this content with the audiences, regardless of format. And we can test some things. Word of warning, the audience behaviors will also be changing. So we do like a really good, well-documented and super well-analyzed test of something next year, and then we think we figured something out, and then we do the exact same thing 2 years later, and it might not work because something else might have changed in the environment meanwhile. But still, testing and thinking is better than not testing at all. And this is the time when we have to be able to afford to take those risks, because let's face it, there's going to be so much content that basically nothing will be guaranteed. No successes will be guaranteed. So we might as well just try a bunch of different release strategies and communication strategies and see what works. I asked a lot of people, how long will this boom go on? And the answers depend very much on exactly how the question is phrased. But on average, we're probably going to make 5 years from now fewer feature films. But we've been saying that for a while, but probably fewer. We all hope fewer, because this current situation is not sustainable. Probably about the same amount of high-end drama, but I don't know if that means the same amount as today or the same amount as 2 years from now. Probably more like the same amount as today, which is great, because again, long term, we might not be able to sustain this extreme production. And then some other types of content are probably, there's going to be less of some other things. But that's fine, because there's going to be more of other types of video content, so everybody will have work in the industry, but not everybody who wants to be a filmmaking auteur will be able to do that. That's going to be reserved for the people who can actually deliver things that are artistically good enough and complex enough and aesthetic enough and relevant enough to connect with the audience. Yes. So all of these good news come with an on the other hand, or like a little warning, like, oh, we're going to make so many things, but what if our quality starts slipping? Then we're fucked. Sorry, I was cursing so much. And there's a bunch of these things where we need to look very carefully at the good news and see what the risks are as well. And one thing that is raised in the report a fair amount is this question about how the role of the producers is in the process of changing now, and whether we're going to allow that to happen or whether we're going to push back. So of course, if you ask the European Producers Club, they say we're going to push back big because the producers are in many ways the protector of content diversity. Now, if you're a commissioner, you might not 100% agree with that, or you will agree like yes, but, or yes, and. Yes, and, yes, and. And I think there are a lot of positions, there are a lot of issues where we have some historical or current tensions in the industry, or our our short-term interests are not aligned, like with most questions around the rights. Obviously, short-term interests are in conflict. But we're going to really, really need to look at what our long-term goals are now, so that we can find those yes, and, yes, and, yes, and conversations, and see where do we agree, and how do we think that production will serve us best, for instance, which power dynamic between producer, director, and scriptwriter will help us produce the kind of content with the kind of depth and quality that we have been used to in Europe, and that we want to even raise the question further. But also there are some questions about who owns the audience relationship. And the audience relationship, of course, cannot only happen through data, but the big data is going to be very important. And there, if you don't have access to the quantitative data, you can always complement it with the qualitative data. And one of our interviewees is Susanna Snell, who is head of audience insight at Yle in Finland. And I said, how will your job have changed 5 years from now? And she said, well, I will be drowning in data because of how the technical distribution changes. We're going to know so much on an individual level almost about viewers. But what do we do with all of this data? And it's going to demand completely different ways of working just 5 years from now. And I said, okay, so does that mean more AI tools to analyze the data, or more spending time with actual humans? And she said, spending time with actual humans, absolutely. We're going to have all this data, but you don't know what to do with the data if you don't speak with real humans first. Because the data can tell you anything you want it to tell you. That's how complex it is. And in addition, of course, an AI is a machine that we've given some relatively non-transparent methods or rules for how to analyze the data. So we have to also put a lot of effort into really understanding the AI tools, so that we see what data does it obscure. We have to understand that as deeply as we understand what it shows, right? And again, the way to do that, luckily, is not expensive. That is the normal way of doing it is you spend a lot of time in depth with fewer actual individuals. That's going to help you find your way. And always, I think, when we feel that we're losing our way in this creative chaos of the next few years, going back to the audience and going back to who the audience is for the particular work and where they are and where their lives are and how their lives and viewing work, that's going to be the answer. Yeah, finally, when we're not connecting with the audience and when we're having talent problems in the industry, this goes back to that beyond 50-50 thing. It's not enough to say that we can do better on diversity, or like maybe women should direct more things. I've noticed that a lot of the projects we've mentioned here have directors with female names, and that's fantastic. And here's the thing. Acting on diversity is first easy, and then it's hard. And the part that is easy is that there is a glass ceiling. There has been, there still is, a glass ceiling in our industry that that means that there are a lot of people with experience who haven't quite been able to have the careers that they should have had. And now we're sort of hacking on that glass ceiling from above and saying, okay, no, maybe you should work. Come, we need you all. And then there's a whole pool of people, and that pool of people is working, and that's a rapid change. That's easy. What is difficult to do is to find the racism that we have internalized, or find the structure or the ageism or whatever it is. Any kind of diversity that we're not delivering on is probably because of entrenched structures in our organizations and internalized bias in ourselves individually. And it's super difficult to find out about that. And you probably need to take a class, and we all need to be constant diversity learners. You can be very woke, and you will still not ever be done with this. Like, we're all, because of privilege per definition is invisible, right? So we need to keep learning and keep working with who are we, what does it look like really? And when we're not connecting to the audience, of course, then this is the kind of things where we have been failing. the good part about dealing with diversity now is that it actually addresses a lot of problems that we have. It addresses the talent problem, because recruitment is going to be better. And especially we have to look at can we make content that is relevant to younger audiences, because younger people who are interested in audiovisual production tend to drift towards like the YouTube video social end of the industry, because they understand what those careers look like, but they have no idea what a grip is. So we want to make content that is relevant for those audiences so that we can also make recruitment into our sector, part of this sector, possible. But also diversity, and especially I think diversity and people being seen in the content, means that we can access new audiences that are currently spending those 5 audiovisual hours on something else than our content. And that means that we can actually grow the audience, which is super helpful. And yeah, also, it's great if you want to fight fascists to represent the world as it actually looks. So that's also great. I'm out of time. Tomorrow at 3:30 at BU Palatset, I will speak about these things and some other things in some depth, after which we're going to have a completely kick-ass panel about how to move forward with diversity work, with some best practices and so on. You can find the whole report at this address. You can also find all of the previous year's reports there. Takes less than 2 hours to read, and it's free. Yes. Thank you, Filminvest, for that. The download will be available tomorrow at 6 p.m.